So, I'm standing in front of a white pristine sheet of paper, and I'm going to draw you a story and mess it up. I want to tell you a tale of how we made our way into the biggest of messes, and perhaps sketch out a way we might make our way out of it. Now, this story starts like all stories, once upon a time, billions of years ago, when where we are now looked pretty much like this, except not quite so white. But it wasn't empty. It was full of forces. It was full of elemental matter. It was full of energy. And 4.5 million years ago, these forces conspired to pull this matter and energy into a large, hot, glowing orb. Now, the forces were so extreme that in the middle they pulled these hot, heavy metals together, forcing them to become solid, forming a dense core. And around that, where the forces were still extreme and the energy was overpowering, though, the metals didn't stay liquid, and they, around this core, they formed an outer core of molten metals. And yet further out, where the energy was less, but the elements were lighter, silicates mixed with the metals, making rock, but rock that remained molten. And this molten rock flowed around these cores, forming a mantle. And then finally, out on the edge, where there was the least energy, the rock was so able to become cool enough so that finally it could solidify, forming a thin crust. Now, this crust was leaky, and it leaked gases out from the molten interior into the atmosphere. And when finally the whole orb had lost enough energy, these gases condensed, and it began to rain. And it rained, and it rained, and it rained. It rained for thousands of years onto the crust, until it was all covered in one vast ocean. And it was in this ocean that something extraordinary happened. Life happened. It was simple, but very durable. And for billions of years, it was born, it swam around, it drifted, it died and settled to the bottom, over and over and over again, slowly evolving into new, perhaps more complex life forms. And so when it went on, simply for billions of years, but inside the Earth, this energy of these molten masses continued churning, and at some point they pushed up the crust, up through the oceans, forming a vast landmass, a supercontinent that we call Pangaea. And life took this opportunity to leave the sort of oceans and explore new ways of evolving and inventing itself on land. But it wasn't long before this constant churning of the Earth broke up this landmass. It broke up the sort of Asia from Europe and Africa, sort of drove up the Himalayas, came down, volcanoes came up, created a place like Japan, going around the Pacific Islands, more volcanoes, come around, pushed up North America, pushed up sort of the Andes of South America, the Rockies of North America, up through the ocean, the Appalachians, Newfoundland, came back down below the ocean, finally through the Atlantic, pushing up Great Britain, until the Earth looked somewhat like what we know today, the planet we call home. And life was now continuing to evolve, but isolated on these different islands, and each sort of created its own distinct flora and fauna. And the Earth in its way, continued to push and pull, pushed up those ancient sort of plains beneath the sea, folded up mountains. Volcanoes came up, for other things. Canyons were formed. The waters flow and carved out rivers. And so continued until about 350,000, 100,000 years ago. Something even more extraordinary. 350,000 years, apology. Somewhere here in Africa, our first relatives came on the scene. And they were quite simple, and they were very much at the whim of what the earth was thrown at them, but they hunted and they gathered, and they sort of wandered around a bit. But 20,000 years ago, somebody had an earth-shattering idea. They thought, a bit tired of this wandering, so they took the seeds they're about to put in their mouth, and they cleared the ground and dug it up. And instead of grinding the seeds, they put them in the ground. And then all they had to do was wait till the seeds grew into crops. And at this point, we didn't have to move at all anymore. But it's curious, at the point we didn't have to move, it's the point we started to. And we migrated around the globe, across the continents, first Asia, then over on into North America, spread down to South America, over to Britain, finally to the islands of the Pacific. And there we went on developing, each in our own unique ways. But with these full bellies and lots more energy, we found had more time on our hands, and we were quite good at making things. And we made things to keep the rain off our head, to keep our feet clean, to keep ourselves warm, to keep the wolves out. And when we made together, we made more constructions. We filled our houses with little inventions, and when we gathered, we made settlements, and those settlements were turned into cities. And we made culture in the cities. Now, with all this sort of making, we needed stuff, and we found we could dig up those sort of ancient rocks out of the ground. And out of those rocks, we could fabricate stone. And with stone, we could invent further things. We made things like arches. We stacked stone upon stone, stone upon stone, onto the ground. And with these, we could fabricate our cities. We could make these cities we thought would be eternal. The final piece. And we went on in isolation, but almost like a mass brain, developing these cities all over the globe, everywhere, each in a different way. But this isolation was shattered about 500 years ago when Christopher Columbus got in his boat and he sailed across the Atlantic. And he said he discovered the Americas, but in reality we know he's about 10,000 years too late for this. But what he did to do was more significant. When people got news of this, other people went in their boats and crossed. And they started a tremendous exchange between the Americas, Asia, Europe, Africa. They exchanged plants, they exchanged animals, either dead or alive. They exchanged people, free, enslaved. They exchanged resources, they exchanged technologies, knowledge, always going back and forth suddenly across. And what he succeeded in doing was reconnect these land masses like they hadn't been since Pangaea. In a way, he re-established Pangaea. And with this increase in sort of knowledge and resource that they had, things followed very quickly onto the Industrial Revolution, where now we discovered that we didn't only have to dig up, we could not only dig up rock to make things like stones, we could dig up rock, mine deep into the lands. And we could dig up rock that we could burn. And by burning this rock, we could release these tremendous amounts of energy that had been made by those creatures so long ago. And with this energy, we could convert it into steam power, and we could smelt iron. As quickly these ideas went around the world, this sort of manufacture, and we could literally make the amount we could make or exchange went sky high, quite literally. And the cities grew, and very quickly we learned, well, also we could sort of drill down into the earth and get other forms of energy, liquid energy, that we could take with us, or maybe it's better to say it could take us with it. And we've built railways to cross the continents. We built steamships that could cross the oceans. We built airplanes that could cross the skies, take us from one side of land masses to the other, or across the oceans. All the time knitting this world together tighter and tighter. And our cities grew with this massive exchange. And our factories grew. Factories in the city. All over the world. And then we discovered we could dig even deeper into the earth and bring up even more ancient rocks with even more energy. And with those rocks, we created an almighty bang. Two of them, in fact. And you would have thought, with this bang, we would have maybe taken stock of things, it would have given pause for thought, but we actually took it as a starter gun, and so started something we called the Great Acceleration, where our making suddenly knew no pace, no bounds. We saturated the lands with fertilizer to grow food for some of us. We sprayed pesticides so that other creatures wouldn't eat our food, nor would they be able to live close to it. We sprayed our armpits and our hair with aerosols, and that in turn, we sprayed the atmosphere with it. We filled the atmosphere with TV waves and radio waves. Crossing the skies. We filled our pockets in our houses, and our cities full of plastics, and when that was full, we filled the oceans with them. We sent rockets to space and satellites, beamed down signals, kept track of us, went over the poles, and even left space debris up above here. And we just kept making and making, which brings us up to today, where we've made our cities have expanded into the seas, they've expanded into the deserts, they've expanded into the forests. We've got to the point where there's almost no aspect of the air, there's no aspect of the land, there's no aspect of the waters which we have not affected. We've sort of equaled the sort of inner fire of the earth on our effect on it. And we've become a geological force, a force that is one of the making forces of the crust of the world. And we've even made a time, an epoch. We've called this the Anthropocene. Now, the Anthropocene is both a time, but it's also a place. And it's not a very happy place. In all this making, we've managed to sort of make holes in the ozone. We've acidified the oceans. We've melted the ice. We've raised the sea levels. We've caused extinction. We've basically caused a bit of a mess. And in the long term, this Anthropocene will just be another thin geological layer with our bones in and evidence of our city disappearing. But in the present and the future, which is a time important to us, we are threatened like we never have been. It's so personal. So this is where I come into the story. Now I want to take you somewhere else. I want to take you to rural Canada in the 70s, where I grew up. Now I find, when I tell people that I grew up in Canada, they said, that must have been amazing, like growing up with all that nature. And I always think, well, not really, because I didn't think I grew up in the midst of nature. I grew up in the countryside. The countryside was a place where you built barns, you put up telegraph poles, you drove on streets, you plowed fields, you drove tractors, the cows were grazing, fences were dug. But I did know where the countryside was, or the nature was. I did know where nature was. It was these areas on the map, bounded and colored solid green, different than the white areas and the areas of the streets. And these were the national and provincial parks. And the biggest of these was far away, across the border in the States, Yellowstone Park. And this was where, 100 years before, they decided to put a line around a bit of the American West, and they created the world's first national park. And it was always present in my childhood. There were TV specials all the time about Yellowstone. You could sort of see this place with these majestic soaring mountains. There's sort of the pines rising to the sky. There were the deer with their amazing antlers, the big racket antlers, grazing near the sort of water's edge, or climbing the hills in the mountains. And there was always a lone eagle soaring up above, and fish in the streams, and it was all such a romantic vision. And it usually was accompanied by like a big romantic symphony. But I always felt there's something strange about this, but I didn't know why. But around the same time, there are other strange things happening. There was these people in vans with flowers painted on the side, traveling through my countryside to who knows where. It turns out there were about 500,000 of these people on the roads in North America, searching for utopia, or to find utopia, or when they couldn't find it, they actually tried to make utopias. And they made sort of communities based upon sort of spiritual grounds, where they tried to find themselves or find better ways of living together through looking at their own religion and the religions of others. Some were founded on looking what we'd done long ago, the way we lived in the past, and that other cultures had lived, whether it be sort of teepees or yurts, nomadic cultures, again trying to find a better way. There were the artistic colonies, the ones where they thought, well, as artists we can come together and we can find ways to make sort of new expression of form which might relate us better to each other, or relate us to the sun or to the environment. Then there were the sort of technological ones. There were so many of these when I was young. Geodesic domes, right? These sort of technologically efficient structures that were sort of the new world. They were sort of quite often related to new ecologies, and they were looked at as sort of a place where you could even put ecologies inside. You had biospheres with all the nature inside of these domes. And there were places where you could get away for 3 days. You could get away and sit in the middle of a field, muddy field usually. Just listen to music and think about how the world could be better. Or where you could go and burn the man in the desert and then leave, leaving no trace. And what these things had in common is all these people trying to find a way they realize we're going to a mess and they want to find a way, maybe think about ideas out of the mess. And there were many things came about during that period and since. There were ideas, there's ideas like eco-houses and passive houses, houses which draw their energy from the ground or from the sun, from the wind, and isolate us from the outside to ensure our comfort while not leaving too big of an ecological footprint on the outside. There's ideas like circular economies where they talk about how you take natural resources, renewables and finite ones, and try to maintain them in a sort of cycle of our use that's regenerative rather than just one use. Or one of the biggest of them all, these ideas that you got the zero carbon footprint. But the thing I like to tell you about these communities is they nearly all failed. And I always wondered why, until a few years ago I saw a diagram which I thought may give me a clue. The diagram was done in 1948 at the beginning of the Great Acceleration. It's called the Circular Flow Diagram by Paul Samuelson, an economist. And what that diagram was supposed to do was show the flow of business, between business and the household, how the household supplied labor to business and bought the goods. The business paid for labor and made the goods for the household. But this diagram, it was simple and it was just supposed to explain one simple thing. But it mutated into this diagram that people started to use to explain how we existed. Everything about how we lived on the planet. And I think, mistakenly, these people took some of this diagram with them, which is quite understandable, because it was like a stowaway. Because the bit they took with them was the bit they couldn't see. And they couldn't see it because it wasn't drawn. They call it Samuelson's deceit. And what it is a pretend boundary around the diagram. A boundary that does acknowledge that this diagram is dependent upon drawing resources from the planet, that it exhausts its waste and outputs into the planet. And what we need to be aware of is that that's even in things like Yellowstone, where this boundary of nature inside and the business of America outside, it's always been pretend. And it's in Yellowstone where I could show you this and where there might be the beginnings of an answer to this. Because you see, that Yellowstone I saw in my childhood, with the soaring pines, the boundary wasn't so solid like they claim. Because this need to keep the wolves out 20,000 years ago had evolved into a need to keep wolves out of our lives altogether. And the Yellowstone I saw in the 70s wasn't real because we'd extracted something. We'd extracted the wolves. They no longer existed in this nature. Now, what I'd like to tell you about is that at some point in the 90s, they said, let's put the wolves back. And everyone panicked and said, you can't do that. It'll be a catastrophe. The wolves will eat the deer. They'll chase away the animals. The change will be unimaginable. And you know what? The change was unimagined. Because they did put the wolf back. But what happened is the deer were not stupid. A few got killed. But most of them got a bit forest-wise. They said, well, better not hang out near the sort of streams or in the valleys where the wolves would catch us easily, they went deeper into the forest. And what that allowed was things, the saplings, the young trees they'd always been munching on, start to grow. Cottonwoods and willows grew up throughout the forest. And when they grew, they got munched by something else. They got munched by the beavers. And beavers built their dams in the rivers, slowed down the flow, and the young fish were able to hide amongst the twigs of the dams, and the fish multiplied. And then aquatic animals start to come back and multiply. And because there were so many more trees growing up in the forest, the birds came back. They had more habitat. And the birds flew over the landscape, they dropped their seeds and the berries, and things grew on the ground. And once that happened, small animals like squirrels and rabbits came back, raccoons. The coyotes couldn't hunt them so easy because the wolves were harrying them a bit. And birds of prey came, and they fed on the small animals or on the carrion that the wolves were leaving behind. And what the wolves had done, they had created an explosion of life. But they'd done something else, because once the trees had stabilized the banks, the flow of the river changed. It became slower. They became wider. They created ponds. They changed the courses and their routes. The wolves had not only created an explosion of life, they changed the landscape, the physical geography of Yellowstone. They created this trophic cascade, as it's called, of life. And what we call this, something that does that, we now call it a keystone species. Like the arch, where this keystone keeps the whole assembly from tumbling down. The wolf with his big bad ears, and his big bad eyes, and his big bad nose, and big bad mouth, creates the whole system he lives in from falling apart. The system that supports him, he supports it as well. And about the same time I heard about Keystone Species, I heard an interview with an environmental activist who said to the interrogator, man is a keystone species, or humans are a keystone species. And I thought, yes. And then I thought, no, not really. Because, well, like the wolf, we change landscapes, and we do it in a much bigger way. We do it in this epic way. We're changing everything. Where the wolf expands life, we diminish it. But it's a very alluring idea that we could become a keystone species. And seeing as we're makers, I even thought, maybe, what if man could become a keystone maker? What would this mean? And one of my first thoughts, it mean acknowledging our footprints. Not just making them less, but acknowledging that we make footprints, and that each one that we make is related to other ones. That we're constantly making these footprints. We will do this just because that is part of our nature. We live. But if we acknowledge the connection to others, we'd influence. Each footprint would start influencing the others. And hopefully, by being aware of that, our footprints could lead to better and more fruitful paths. Now, I was trying to think of had I seen something like this. So I want to finish with one final story. So I'm going to take you when I was first in Europe, and I got stuck in a place called Kassel in Western Germany between trains, and with the 3 hours to kill, I walked around the town, neatly constructed, post-war German town. But one thing struck me, I kept coming across these little stone bollards, each with a young tree beside it. And I found them all over the town. And I was sort of wondering what they were, because it was quite strange. The bollard wasn't tied to the tree, so it wasn't really supporting it. So I really put it down to sort of, well, maybe it's just to keep the cars from hitting them, knocking them over, and I actually sort of filed in sort of my strange foreign encounters sort of bit of my brain. But it turns out these bollards were planted by a man called Joseph Beuys. Now, Joseph Beuys was one of the major sort of artists of this Great Acceleration period. He was a sculptor, a performance artist, but he also considered himself to be a shaman and a teacher. Now, at the same time I wanted to go to Yellowstone as a kid to see nature, Joseph Beuys also wanted to see nature in North America. But he went instead to New York City. And there, he locked himself in a room with a coyote for 3 days. Now, what I like to think is the coyote, being a bit annoyed that the wolf being chased around Yellowstone, it told Joseph what the wolf was really up to, revealed his sort of secrets. Because when Joseph went back to Germany, he started this project in Kassel called 7,000 Oaks. And basically, Joseph and his volunteers planted these stone stelae made out of basalt into the ground with an oak sapling next to each of them. It's called 7,000 Oaks. And over time, they did that. They planted 7,000 of these. Now, so we have these 7,000 pieces in, but it's easy to imagine what Wiki calls this is land art. Now, what Joseph called it was Stadtverwaltung, Stadtverwaltung, which means city foresting instead of city administration, which is a much more open thought. The other thing I like to throw into this, what Wiki doesn't say much about, is about the same time, what a lot of people don't know is Joseph Beuys was one of the founders of the German Green Party. Now, if you put this together, you might think about this project a bit differently. And Joseph Beuys was famous for making his own life history, so I'm going to play a little bit more with that life history, making up a story, the final bit of my story here. So he did explain it. It's easy to imagine this as this footprint, this work of art. He explained the oak tree as being like a sculpture itself, as the basalt as being a marker. Yet you have to mark the starting of something, a great project. But I'd like to think he was thinking much more deeply. It's much more conscious about what he was doing in this Keystone way. That he knew that eventually these oaks would grow into grand trees with their canopy all over the city. And that in these canopies, life would come on. Insects would go into the bark and crawl up the trees. That the trees, just like in Yellowstone, would become homes to sort of other life forms, become home to birds. It'd become home to squirrels. That it might explain why Kassel has sort of Germany's biggest raccoon population. But beyond this, I'd like to think he was thinking much more, because this is sort of obvious, it's just a sort of forest. But what about using his shaman abilities that he was able to, before the internet, it didn't exist then, he was able to tap into this knowledge, make connections to other ideas that were evolving around the world and that were important. What about if he knew that these trees might sort of soak up the nitrous oxide from the cars and make the environment better for those that were beneath it? What about if he knew that trees actually can take carbon out of the atmosphere, they could lock it up and drive it through the roots down into the soil? What about if this was part of his project, or the potential of his project that he was trying to achieve? What about if he knew once that carbon was in the soil, that would help the soil to fertilize, the worms and soil cultures would sort of grow? But what about even with the basalt? What if you knew these stones, like lichen and mosses, would grow on them, and that would fall, and it also helped to sort of reform the ground? That digging the hole would disturb, so allow water to flow down. What about if he was thinking about that? This basalt would come from somewhere, and where it came from would maybe create new sort of wetlands when the quarries filled up, or would they create new sort of ravines where wildlife would thrive? What about if you even knew that the dust from the basalt itself, when spread sort of on fields of farmers, would combine with the carbon, both fertilizing the field, but also taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And if you think of the project like this, and if you think that's what you might have been doing, it becomes way larger than 7,000 oaks. That's what I mean by a Keystone project. So what about if when we were making, we still did things, we still kept the rain off our heads, we still kept our feet clean, we still kept ourselves warm, we still kept the wolves out. But what if in that thinking we were also thinking in a bigger way? By that we were trying to clean the air and the sky. We knew that what we were doing might affect other ecosystems, allowing them to thrive. That we might be creating new landscapes, not maybe in our immediate vicinity, but in other places. And that we might be making the world better for each other. Together. That would be a Keystone project. But that's the beginning of another story. Thank you.